Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. We're going to call this the Boxscore Geeks Kevin Love double shot. As you know, the Boxscore Geeks drinking game, one of the topics is if we bring up Kevin Love, you take a shot. And it's not our fault this week. You will definitely see with our first topic, the Kevin Love trade finally went through. And oh my goodness, there's so much to talk about. But we've got a little more beyond that. As an appetizer, before we even get started, Arturo, I was happy this didn't completely derail the podcast, which it had the possibility to. You give a shout out to the That Thing You Like podcast, particularly Brian Sherla and Christopher Baxter. This is this week's poll, not even a question. Doesn't even matter what else we come up with. The question was if you're with Team Taco or with Team Pizza. So this derailed their podcast for 40 minutes arguing. You and I, though, seem to agree. I am, of course, Team Pizza. Arturo, you are?
Team Pizza, particularly deep dish. Now, are you deep dish or thin crust?
I am a New York style. I tend to like the thin crust.
See, yeah, but we're not gonna have this argument though. So it's
okay,
like,
I might have to put up a second poll then. So we're Team Pizza, deep dish, thin crust. But that's
Chicago. I'm a Chicago style man.
They're not half bad to be behind. And yeah, definitely I would take Chicago above New York if we're talking basketball style this year. All right, so apologies. In the midst of getting excited about pizza, I forgot to introduce ourselves. I'm Dre Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers. With me is Arturo Galletti, who goes on Twitter by Arturo Galletti.
Yeah, and then you may be familiar with me from my work in other podcasts, such as the Real GM podcast and
nice shout out immediately.
Coach Nick. Well, and that's a bit of a shout out too to the Simpsons Marathon. So I'm doing Troy McClure. So God bless you, Phil Hartman.
Yeah. Well, that is a good shout. We'll try and remember him. Shout out time too to just bookend this. And then finally, we have our producer, the voice of God, Brian Foster. As always, Brian, just say hey in case we pull you in later.
I'm always ready. Let me know when it's time.
I was going to say, you do well in the podcast when we pull you in. You're not like our Brian Scalabrine when we bring you in because the game's just over and we're accepting either defeat or victory. So we'll have to come up with another term for you for that. All right.
I'm always trying to get up as many shots as I can, and I just don't care how efficient it is, Dre.
Regular Allen Iverson. Or who's a good bench player? Arturo, this is not for this podcast, but I have a question, and I might look this up myself. Who is the best chucker bench player? Maybe J.R. Smith? He's pretty good. Sixth man? Oh,
chucker bench? You mean in the league right now?
I think all time, like a player that gets like under 15 minutes, but every time they win in the game, they just chucked up as many shots per minute.
Goodness. I think Benny Johnson's got to be up there. God, I can't think of anybody else off the top of my head. I'll look this up. We'll look for high usage guys who play less than 15 minutes. Do we want to be good or do we want to be just chuckers?
Just a chucker. And in fact, if they're more of a bad chucker, that makes it better. But we'll see if you beat us to this because we'll get this posted tonight and we'll see how lazy we are on getting that around. All right, so the Kevin Love thing, there's a ton to talk about here, so I'm actually going to skirt around the real topics first. The 76ers managed to do a Billy Beane style, get involved in a trade they had no reason being in, and in doing so did one of the most impressive things I've ever seen, which led to one of the most impressive screen grabs I've ever seen. The 76ers no longer have any bad contracts on their team, and in fact, the most expensive, I believe, contract is Nerlens Noel's contract for around $10 million, and that's if you include the options. This is, to me, Arturo, and you'll just have to let me know if I'm wrong, this is unheard of in the NBA to ever have a team that basically says we're not going to have any deals over $5 million for long term. I think Jason Richardson is the only one.
I believe, yeah. Jason Richardson is $6 million, and they're going to move him. I think it's very counter to the typical logic, which is I got to pay because I have this money. So Hinkie has obviously kind of figured something out. And we've said this before, where like he's not going to pay any bad contracts. And now that he's in this position, he can do all sorts of interesting things. And we're going to share a link where, you know, they're basically playing their entire roster. They could trade their entire roster for Kobe Bryant, and it would work.
That was the best thing ever, that the 76ers have the ability to trade their entire roster for Kobe. That's amazing.
They could trade the building and every single player in it for Kobe Bryant. I mean, they wouldn't do that, but they could. They also have, I believe it's something on the order of 38, and I'm going to have to check this out, but I believe they have $38 million in cap room. So they could take, they could just take Amari Stoudemire and like Andrea Bargnani off the Knicks' hands for like maybe an exchange of goods. You'll find $5 or $10 million in this unmarked bag if you do it. So they can and they can do all sorts of interesting things with that roster because again they're not trying to win now, they're trying to win in the future. So basically, by doing this, they can get into a position where like they can just continue to pick up assets because, as I said, they can go. So the Knicks want to get rid of Bargnani. It's like we'll take Bargnani. It's like we'll take Bargnani for a season.
Don't forget the Knicks unfortunately just have been giving out picks like candy in trades, and they're capped, and I think that makes a lot of GMs sad. One thing to kind of like your point though, and what you just said, and this has been something we've been yelling at the Boxscore Geeks for years. I want to repeat. Patrick went and told Sam Hinkie at Sloan just what a fan he was of his work. There is a difference between intentionally losing and not overpaying for wins. So, for instance, Thaddeus Young was a good player. I think he had a down year last year, but if you look at his career, he's been a good player. He's just not worth around $10 million a year. So they said, we're not going to pay you $10 million a year. They did the same thing with Spencer Hawes. They did the same thing with Evan Turner. They basically said, we're willing to.
He's not worth it to them. I mean, I think it's clear. I think the Thaddeus Young contract is not a bad contract if you're a team that actually needs a player like that.
I'd say it's a little overpriced.
Well, again, keep in mind that we talked about this. You're getting everybody at a cut rate because the prices are going to kind of climb. So
I'm leaving that off the table for this discussion because that's going to be universal to everybody. And even if you're going in that case, the 76ers are going to be in the best shape for that when that happens.
I think if you're the T-Wolves, then because Thaddeus Young, unless you're going to move him later on, like the T-Wolves aren't making the playoffs. So if they're not making the playoffs, then Thaddeus Young is a luxury. But like a team that like had a shot, so if you put Thaddeus Young on, say, the Thunder, then he might be worth $10 million to the Thunder. Like if you put him next to Ibaka and like just play him like as like your other big, then there are certain teams where like he would be worth the price of admission. It's just on the T-Wolves, I agree he's at the overpriced luxury. For example, I think Spencer Hawes on the Clippers is fantastic. And he's worth every penny because
he's only like 5 or 6. He's dirt cheap to them too, actually.
Yeah, he's dirt cheap and he's a luxury at like the biggest weakness that team had was they had no third big. So now they have a third big that can play the 5, the 4 and stretch it, play some decent defense and stretch it by taking good shots next to Chris Paul. Yeah. So to them, he's I
didn't see his contract as bad to begin with, but like almost to your point on Thad Young, there is, and yeah, this is an interesting topic that we hadn't even gotten to, and actually this will tie in well when we get to Kevin Love, is there is the notion in the NBA that most teams don't really recognize, which is how short their windows are. I think people stretch how big they think championship windows can be, or even just competing windows. And so if you're a team like the Thunder, I'll actually tell you that the Thunder, I don't think there is such a thing as overpaying for any productive player they can add to that team, because the honest truth is their window only exists as long as too many awesome Kevins. Kevin Durant is there, and there is a good shot that Kevin Durant, especially with that salary cap you're talking about, possibly going up with the new TV deals, hop and ship for a big market. Philadelphia might not look that bad.
You're missing. You're about 100 or 200 miles off. You got to get closer to the capital, to DC, to get it right for Kevin Durant. This is being telegraphed.
You think he's going to go to the Warriors, or not the Warriors? Sorry, the Wizards.
He's going to. I have every indication that he's going to the Wizards, because the money is there. He's from there, so I think that I think he's going to the Wizards.
Wow.
I think unless something weird happens, that's what's going to happen. That's what's.
But that's what I'm saying. To the Thunder, if your goal is to be as competitive as possible now, you're running out of time. Pay the freaking money. That's actually been one of the Thunder's MOs lately, right? Is that, they let Harden walk a year earlier than they needed to. They're probably going to be in the same situation soon with Reggie Jackson. It's like, listen, you have two choices. You can be a pretty good team until Kevin Durant leaves, or you can win, and that means spending money. But anyway.
Oh, by the way, I've got 3 names for that Chucker contest you were asking me for.
Oh, let's hear
it. I've got Dominique, but Dominique didn't play enough minutes. It was Dominique with the Clippers, so he doesn't count. But I've got Walter Davis.
But he was Was he off the bench?
No, he got hurt that year. So this is Walter Davis. Number 1 is Walter Davis for the 1991 Denver Nuggets, who played 1,044 minutes, and he basically used 35.4 offensive possessions per 48. So like more than a third. This is Rudy Gay kind numbers.
Wow.
Then I've got Del Curry for the Charlotte Hornets in 1989. He used 34.5 possessions. And then I've got Ricky Pierce for the Seattle Supersonics at 34.4. And of the three, actually, so I've got Ricky Pierce is like about a point positive. I've got Del Curry is negative 1.24, and Walter Davis is negative 3.47 points per 48. So
gotta bring up those horrible Nuggets to me, huh?
That's terrible. I mean, that's just kind of insane.
But that's the kind of play that got us to Kemba Mutombo.
Oh, but by the way, and you're like the other guys who show up on that are like it's Terry Teagle and then Gilbert Arenas in that list. So
Arenas, but I mean him after injury. I mean, we can talk more about this in a bit, but injury is just one of those annoying things to players. But on to kind of forward-thinking contracts. This was spooky to me. So I read an article from from ESPN about the Minnesota Timberwolves owner on Glenn Taylor, and this. Brian, when I sent it to you, you told me your immediate response was, "Is this an onion piece?" Because it's Glenn Taylor basically doing his impression of the Dan Gilbert exit letter, where he's saying Kevin Love on the new team is going to have defensive liabilities and he's going to have to handle not being the best on the team. And he didn't realize how good they had it in Minnesota. And, oh, yeah, he's still cool with Kevin Love. And that Kevin Love doesn't realize how good the Minnesota front office treated him. Be aware in the last contract negotiation, one of the rumors, or maybe real things, was that they dropped the contract extension in the weight room when Kevin Love was training. And this was kind of their, dick swinging move to prove why Kevin Love just needed to take their offer. And this is remarkable, just remarkable stuff to see.
This is basically sour grapes being played out on a global scale, and I think that this also shows a short-sightedness because you don't want to kind of embarrass your star on the way out if you want to get other guys to come to your team. I think there was a great stat there. He's talking about how he is foul prone, and I think like the guys were showing that like if you looked at like fouls per 48 minutes for big men in the NBA, he was the best. He fouled the least of any big man. So it's ridiculous. Again, it's kind of. It's about how ethical you are in your dealings with your subordinates. And again, when you're that rich, sometimes you get to the point where you don't have to necessarily be that ethical. But it does when you're dealing with players. If you embarrass yourself like this, it can have consequences down the line. I mean, I think Gilbert got lucky in the fact that, and I think I didn't talk about this here, but I talked about it in the podcast, which I said Gilbert got lucky in the fact that like LeBron set up a management company for players, and he signed all the Cleveland guys. So he's basically making money off his contract, and basically he's making money off the Kyrie contract. He's making money off the Raiders. Yeah, he represents Kyrie, his company represents Kyrie. So basically, it's almost like
I'll give LeBron James in that, and this is really hard in business, is letting basically your personal ego set aside to do what's best for business and branding, which, I mean, I think LeBron might have been able to go to a few better teams, but the Cavaliers were not a bad option, especially after we see them getting love. So it's just
especially if you own, if you are the agent for three of the young players that are staying on this team, who like basically, so your personal wealth is not only tied to the fortunes of the team. I mean, in terms of narrative, it's great. In terms of like his long-term career arc, it's great. But he also owns them. He owns Kyrie. It's like he's the agent for Kyrie. So he's going to make a mint of like increasing Kyrie's value to superstar
If you can send
level.
me a link after the show, because I that's definitely got to get included in the notes.
You can look up that. I think in his Draft Express has the agents, but Rich Paul is Kyrie's. It's La Familia. So it's I believe it's Kyrie is represented by Cliff Paul it's Rich Paul. Rich Paul, who's LeBron's buddy for that management company, and I believe Waiters. I could be wrong. I think Tristan Thompson's the other one. So if you so then you're like, oh, so why did you get? It's like so the Kyrie deal where like he's getting signed to this ridiculous extension kind of makes more sense if you figure the fact that it's almost like you're doing a favor for Rich Paul's player management company, which is of which LeBron is a majority owner. So there's a whole kind of as you say, he's putting business before his personal. And again, I think also there's the element that his wife and his kids wanted to go back to Cleveland. And once you put that into like his business interests and everything else, he will never. Nothing has more value to him from a career and kind of historical perspective and probably a monetary perspective than win a title in Cleveland. If he can win a title in Cleveland, that will basically have him set for life.
One thing I'll say about Glenn Taylor too, kind of wrapping this up because the Dan Gilbert thing just upset me, is that one thing people kind of miss in the NBA, and this is just more unfortunate than anything, is that it's not as if when Dan Gilbert's a jerk and you're like, I'm never going to deal with Dan Gilbert, your options are other rich, entitled, primarily, old white owners. Like,
Yeah.
there's not a place to run, right? When everybody was coming down harsh on Sterling, I mean, the players were probably outwardly saying, yeah, you're right. The Clippers were saying they were going to veto a game or something. But the reality is they're like, most of these guys aren't that different. I read a great Cracked article this last week about someone working in a rich person's hotel and just kind of the disconnect rich people have with reality. And you really see that in NBA owners where, like this Glenn Taylor article, the only reason he's saying this is because he's rich. And the reality is anybody who reads this that's been watching the Wolves for years is like, what on earth are you talking about? And this is like, at best, this is kind of a crappy ex-boyfriend negging on his girlfriend to try and get her to come back. It's ridiculous.
And I think, and this is also a piece I did. It's like not only were these like Wolves like rosters bad, but they were like historically some of the worst rosters in the history of the NBA. And again, even this last year where it kind of was a little better. I mean, there was some weirdness going on with the coaching and things that happened at the end of the games where like that team was actually better than the record. But I also think kind of they didn't do a very good job at like putting a smart team together, because I don't think that like Rubio and Love and Pekovic were complementary pieces. Plus, then they had all these like wings that they kept drafting that like were sucky. Like Michael Beasley was not the solution, or like
Michael Beasley was not the solution. Michael Beasley is never the solution, right?
Well, again, I think the point being that like these were like not well thought out teams that were put together. I think now he's going to go to a completely different situation. And this is a very well thought out team. If you look at it, the way it's put together. I mean, as I said, the only piece that kind of gives me angina is like, I wish they had another big, and I don't like Dion Waiters. But everything else on this team, everything else on this Cav team kind of makes sense because, like, you have all these complementary pieces. You added all these shooters. You added veteran guys. Like, you got Marion. You've got, like, Miller. You've got Ray Allen. This is a very well constructed roster. Again,
it is constructed for the short run, which is fine though, based on what LeBron James has signed up for.
But again, this is a much better place to be than any of the Heat rosters were in the last 2 seasons, in the sense that like you have some young pieces, some really young good pieces in like, I mean, again, Love, Kyrie, I like Deladova. I think Tristan Thompson's serviceable. I mean, if Tristan Thompson's like your 8th guy, and on this team he's going to be your 8th guy off your bench, that's fantastic. He's like your 3rd guy off your bench. You're set. He's a good guy to have. So I think, again, where I kind of get stuck, the only thing is they don't have another big, but we're at a point in the NBA where, I mean, this is kind of a luxury, not necessarily you can get, and we've seen LeBron kind of cover this in need and also low. I think if you're forced to go LeBron and K-Love at the 4 and 5, I think you can get away with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they can do everything. And it's
I think you'll be able to get away with it up to the point where you're facing the Spurs or the Thunder in the final, and that's where you kind of go like, oh crap, we can't do this anymore. But yeah, I mean, and again, I think they've got a season to figure it out, and they'll get a discount. People will sign with them at a discount, which is like, when was the last time we ever said that Cleveland was signing players at a discount?
Jeez.
I mean, so it's
even when they were doing the moves around LeBron to kind of shuffle the deck chairs to try and get a title, they still weren't underpaying. They were getting like Ben Wallace and Shaq at $20 million a year.
It's not Cleveland. It's the land now. The land.
Oh, okay.
That's the hashtag now. The land, La Familia and the land. That's what the cool kids are saying.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna stay out of being one of the cool kids, I guess. I'm not doing that. Sorry, Cleveland. One other thing that, just the Glenn Taylor stuff, when I was reading it over and kind of been reading the analysis, one thing I want to give a shout out that you linked to was the Hardwood Peroxium's amazing image. The tweet, and I think we've got this, Brian, is just
The Kevin Love wheel of logic.
The Kevin Love wheel of logic, where people are just, Kevin Love's not good. Why isn't he good? Because he hasn't made the playoffs. Well, why hasn't he made the playoffs? Because he's not good.
He's
And
not
just
good.
back and forth. And no one wants to say he's been, again. I bring this up a lot, and I'm going to keep bringing this up a lot. We might have to make its own shot for this, but look up the Joe Smith trade for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I think this was just far enough before the internet boom of basketball on the internet that people don't realize just how bad this trade was, where basically they signed Joe Smith to 3 1-year under the cap deals so that they could get other players. They didn't get other good players. And then they were going to sign Joe Smith long. And they had this in writing. It's against the CBA, but they had this in writing. So Joe Smith agreed to take a big pay cut to come play on the Timberwolves for them to get other players. They didn't get any good players. So they could then sign Joe Smith, who was terrible, to a long-term deal. And it just blew up in their face, and they lost draft picks for years. That's the management that's been behind, the team that gave up Kevin Garnett to the thank you. That gave up Kevin Garnett to the Celtics, and that is giving love to the Cavs. I won't go as far as saying they've given away a title, because as Arturo points out, the West is still really strong, but they're basically giving out trips to the finals to other teams. That's how badly run this team is. And what I'll say to that is, Patrick mentioned this when Kevin Love inked his deals years ago, was saying all of this was going to come to fruition. I will give us a knock on our predictions, and my out has always been, and will remain to be, and I still need to write up this post, predicting minutes and injuries are really hard, which makes predicting the landscape of the NBA a season out really hard. But when you look at...
I've said that basically you have to kind of, you can't assume that NBA coaches are rational actors or GMs, so you have to kind of pretend to understand the logic behind some very illogical people. So you're like, and then it's like, how do I predict Dwayne Casey? It's like, what is Dwayne Casey going to do with?
And then one little thing shifts, and that changes everything, right? A star gets injured, and George Karl is like, well, I can't play these players. But on that note, our predictions on a lot of stuff like this, you've called where players are going to end up. You've called changes to CBA. This post from Patrick a few years back, and in the morning we're going to have Patrick got a rehash post we'll put up, is remarkable, because when the Wolves signed Kevin Love, they ran him through the ringer to give him a 3-year deal instead of a 5-year deal. It was a 4-year deal, but one was an option.
There's a great piece I read once on the internet. I think it was called "The Tragedy of Kevin Garnett," back on Wages of Wins, and I think the issue on this, and we'll lead this into some other topic. We're playing around with some new metrics based on the games, and looking at like defense and some other stuff, and when you look at it, like Kevin Garnett was the best player in basketball from like in 2003, 4, 5, and 6, and it's really kind of he's a level above, and it's the exact same. Oh, he's not that great because he can't get out of the first round and whatnot. It's like those teams were like, I mean, like the teams that he played with, and the teams like LeBron played with, like early on in Cleveland, were just atrocious when you start looking at those rosters. And Patrick said it in his post, he's like, once he got to Boston, he knew that once you put him like next to some great players, it was going to be insane. And again, those are some historic defensive units in the for those Celtics. And the same thing's going to happen here.
What's impressive about those Celtics teams, by the way, I should give some more love to the Boston guy. Those teams had Glenn Davis on them, and he played minutes, and they were still some of the best defenses ever.
And Brian Scalabrine, we almost made the Celtics. I said the Celtics almost made the finals in 2010 with Glenn Davis and Nate Robinson and Brian Scalabrine prominently involved. They almost beat that Magic team. They would have made the finals. And again, they lost. They had to lose like their starting power forward and their backup power forward and wind up with Glenn Davis. But again, the
You're
point I was
sounding
like
make Chris Ye, you people from franchises with dynasties, and you're whining about not winning one more finals in the middle of multiple trips to the Denver Nuggets fan.
having to watch Glenn Davis play meaningful minutes for your team in a conference finals is kind of, with a chance to the finals, is kind of painful. But I was gonna say is that we watch this play out, and I think it's gonna play out very similarly in Cleveland, where like you're gonna put Kevin Love, who's a great offensive player, and he's decent at defense, and not great, not terrible either. And you're gonna put him on a team where like that's gonna be an all-time great historical defensive team. And I think my only caveat to that team is And somebody was asking me, do I think they're going to be like a historically great offense? It's like my worry is I don't know if Kyrie's mature enough to actually make that happen because a lot of it's going to rely on Kyrie, because I do think Kyrie is going to have to kind of be somewhat unselfish, and he's going to have to be a distributor as opposed to score. I don't know that he can do that immediately, and that's why I wouldn't be willing to say that he's going to be.
One thing I'll say on that, and we've been talking about this. So one of the things you're talking about is new numbers. I'm going to put this out on the podcast, and I'm leaving this to you, the fans, to hold us to. Arturo's been working on new great stuff, and we are going to be releasing more metrics. But one thing I want to make sure we do with how much I badmouth other sites here, with how much I slam, 538. What?
Sorry, I coughed.
I missed the cop. I'll have to listen back and to see who you reference. What's up?
No, sorry. Keep going.
You're gonna make whatever. I'll listen in the thing. It's like we're recording I'm not gonna be able to hear what you said. But anyway, so with that said, anything we release is gonna be highly vetted. Anything new, because I just even though I believe in our work, I don't want to look like other sites where we just throw out new stuff and like I said, it looks like Nate Silver just cherry picks random statistics and throws out posts without much thought. So we're gonna do that. But Arturo's been looking at stuff year to year, but when we look at stats that are consistent year to year, one of the biggest areas of concern is shooting efficiency. This is one of the most highly volatile things. And Kyrie Irving, one of the things that there are two things that have really kept him from being great. His shooting efficiency has dropped since his rookie season, which was troubling, and he's really turnover prone. I believe, and I hate to sound just like you about Russell Westbrook, but I'm going to. So, by the way, everybody in the comments, you can flame me for this because this is subjective Dre. This is not objective Dre. I think Kyrie Irving handling the ball less and having better teammates like LeBron James and Kevin Love will mean that his turnovers are going to drop and his shooting efficiency is going to go up. And I don't even necessarily think it's maturity. I just think next year Kyrie Irving is going to be much better.
So who's going to improve more? Russell Westbrook playing the shooting guard for Oklahoma, or Kyrie Irving next year?
One of the things about Russell Westbrook is one of his biggest things that he does, and this is kind of a cheat, right? He gets a lot of assists because he is a point guard. Anybody who tells me Russell Westbrook's not a point guard, he's a point guard. He gets a lot of assists. If he goes to the shooting guard, he's going to lose those assists. He might lose the turnovers. So we'll see. I don't buy. We've seen Kyrie Irving be a really good shooter his first year. I can see him being great. I still think Russell Westbrook's a chucker. I still think at the shooting guard, he's still going to make dumb decisions.
I mean, again, I think it's interesting. I think it's a role thing. I think the fact that he's going to, again, Kyrie's going to be in a situation where he's going to get as more open looks than he has probably since like any point in his career. And he's also going to have more shooters around him than he has at any point in his professional career. Because I mean, literally, Cleveland will be able to put three great shooters around him at any time, right? And that, I mean, again, start looking down the roster: Miller, Allen, even Marion's not great, but he's not a bad shooter. I mean, LeBron, you've got Love. I mean, that's
what happened. I mean, this is a tangent, and you don't even need to answer here. And by the way, I'm typing to Brian, obviously, as you can see. But he was really good in his prime, and he just. It's not that he's been bad. He just never kind of reached those prime levels. It seems like he took the three-pointer out of his game and just never kind of hit the same efficiencies again.
You mean Marion?
Yeah, Marion.
Yeah, I think partly that was role, and I think that's what Carlisle wanted to do in the system. I don't know that necessarily. I mean, I think it's just a shot that he was getting set up for. It'll be interesting. I mean, I think on this team, the catch and shoot will be there, and we'll see. I mean, he just needs to convert it at a decent clip, not a great clip.
Actually, this is fascinating on Marion. Sorry to cut in. When he was with the Suns, and this is what I'm talking about, he was never great, but when he was with the Suns, he was taking sometimes between 3 and 5 3-pointers a game, and some years he was really good at it, and some years he wasn't.
I will make a comment that some other research that I've done when I've looked at expected points per shot, that those Suns teams that had prime Steve Nash to point shot like they're completely off the scale in like expected points over, like, so this is points over the expected points per shot. So those were like, you can prove that like Steve Nash's effect on offense was completely insane. So again, I think part of that is like, which of those seasons was he getting the ball from like Steve Nash, and I think you have to kind of account for that. So I mean,
Fair enough. But I mean, let's see. Am I mistaken here? Was he decent before? I mean, nah, he wasn't.
he
He
is
was
at
decent before
for his
Nash.
career. For his career, he is a 33.2% 3-point shooter, and the average for his position is 34. So I mean, he's okay. I mean, and like for example, last season he was a 36%
Yeah,
shooter.
last year he did well. So anyway, but yeah, sorry, I got us off tangent. But no, I mean, even just getting Marion around him, Rayon, a lot of that team's just going to come down to health, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know necessarily. I think that Mike Miller is going to play 82 games again, like he did last season. But Mike Miller played 82 games last season. Same thing with Varejao. I could almost guarantee that there's like, there is no chance that like Miller and Anderson, Varejao and Ray Allen and that all these and Marion don't miss time. I mean, those guys are going to miss some time. I think again. They got Tristan Thompson. They got some young guys on that team. I would really, really like if they had a couple more, as I said, big pieces. Maybe a tall, maybe a guard. And I'd be really looking at what I could get for Dion Waiters. And that might be me, and that might not be something that happens because he's a LeBron guy. But that's what I'd be looking for if I was the GM for that team.
All right. So by the way, on this, let's wrap up the Glenn Taylor parting shots. But sorry, Brian and I are passing notes to each other, so apologize, dude. But the Glenn Taylor parting shots at Love, basically, one of the notes he made was about defense, a common thing that comes up around Kevin Love. And Patrick and I discussed this, which was to say, if the Wolves have so many defensive liabilities, which people seem to say, why were they about average? It's not to say, by the way, that I don't think players are not bad at, this sounds weird. I know that there are players that are not good at defense. That's just goes without saying. I do tend to think that people overstate when they find a player like James Harden that they recognize as a bad defender. This may be wrong, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this. I feel that this is I feel that people often overrate how much a player is a defensive liability. And I'd love to hear your thoughts because you did a great video with Coach Nick about the top 5 defenses in the NBA last season.
Well, and I think what's interesting about this is what we've seen a couple things when we start looking at this, which is, and it goes to the idea of diminishing returns, which you've talked about, and we've talked about you actually talked about this in your old blog as well, which is you kind of need to have on defense, you need a defensive anchor on the post and you need a defensive anchor on the wing, right? So if you have those two great players, then you can get away with kind of having guys like David Lee on your defense because
Glenn
like
Davis,
his role,
yep.
Glenn Davis, we're like the role is just going to be limited. It's like, look, you just need to make sure that the cutter doesn't get an open look, and even then, like Glenn Davis will figure out a way to screw that up. But again, where the point is, it's not just like the straight up shot defense; it's how you keep him from doing other things. It's also defensive strategy. I've also talked about this where like the Wolves weren't actually trying to foul people at the rim. So this is actually like this is Rick Adelman's defensive strategy. He's not trying to foul people at the rim. Because he doesn't want to put people on the charity stripe. So they don't challenge people that are going toward the hoop. So his numbers, like Kevin Love's numbers, are kind of impacted by this. But this was a style that their coach chose to play on defense. When you actually look at like Kevin Love's number, without even accounting for his rebounding, he is a slightly above average defender, right? And it's not. In some cases, you'll see
what
this,
you're saying, and what we can be careful with, because I do want to make sure we go back. What you're saying is, if we look at the Minnesota Timberwolves, and before even looking at the individual stats, which I do think I get upset when people leave these out and talking about players' defense. When people say defense, what they always mean is how well the player acts the opponent shooting percentage. They leave out things like steals, blocks, not fouling. By the way, not fouling is a great thing on defense. Unless your options are foul a guaranteed shot or not fouling, not fouling is good on defense, and defensive rebounds. People leave all these things out. They are part of defense. They just mean the first one. But you're saying is if you look at Kevin Love and the production of an average power forward against the Timberwolves last year, it doesn't appear that the average power forward was just getting a huge discount. It doesn't look like Kevin Love was letting people at power forward just get to the hoop.
So here's how he fared, right, against the average power forward for his career. This is how Kevin Love has done. So in 2009, he was slightly below average, about 0.4 of a point below average. In 2010, he was about 0.82 below average. In 2011, he was just about exactly average, about slightly below average. In 2012, he was slightly above average. 2013, he was at average.
And as you
Right,
mentioned,
so
this is not
this is
factoring in. This is not factoring in the individual stats.
I am not including rebounding on this. This is
Okay, okay,
just like
perfect.
straight up
That's what I
production.
want to make clear.
There no rebound. This is just like what did the guy who was facing him do versus like the average player. And last year he was actually about zero point 0.3 over. So there does seem to actually be some improvement on his part, which is kind of
But
expected because
that could be teammate. That could be all sorts of.
well,
but
it also he's a big man hitting his prime. So you expect to see some improvement as you start hitting the prime. So when you and this is like I'm not even including rebounding. Rebounding he is a great rebounder and he's also a great scorer, which is what makes him a great player. But he's like about average at defense. And I think again there was a style that Minnesota was playing where like they were specifically not challenging people at the rim, and also he's not playing next to a great rim. But there is no great defender on that team, right? So as I said, you're not getting Kevin Love to be a great defender. If Kevin Love is the second leg on your defense at the rim, then you're going to be fine. And I think what Cleveland has done, which is like they've got LeBron, they've gotten Marion who can help with that. They've got Varejao.
Marion is helpful.
But yeah, I mean they've got Varejao as well, so they can put something around there where like the worst possible line they could probably put out there with him is probably going to be LeBron and Tristan Thompson, and I think that's still okay because you've got LeBron there. You got to figure out who's going on the wing, but it's not a terrible defense. And again, this is why I say I would love to have them have one more rim protector, but again, that's not the role you're getting Kevin Love for. You're getting Kevin Love to be a great rebounder, a great passer for a big man, and a great scorer for a big man, right? So, and he's it's nobody complained when the Lakers got Pau Gasol. Pau Gasol wasn't a great defender, but he was about league average, and he did everything else you expect from a big man, and this is what made them great, right?
Now, by the way,
the same deal with
question on defense you were kind of mentioning, and this is an advantage. I think I forget who in the comments, so I'll try and link out. But we were talking about Shaq versus Kobe. And I basically said Kobe might have kind of a Crash Davis hatred of Shaq because, Kobe has worked really, really hard to be an elite basketball player. And while the narrative around Kobe is that he is, the reality is that Kobe is just not the same level of some of the all-time greats, including Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille O'Neal is this player that Shaquille O'Neal's goal was not longevity. Shaquille O'Neal basically got that middle three-peat in the middle of his career. He tacked on an extra win, but he didn't keep himself in shape in the offseason. He didn't really keep his body up to snuff. He was more interested in a rap career and a movie career. Yeah. And you kind of have this. Kobe looks at Shaq and goes, "You have the perfect body to play basketball. You are a good in basketball, and you are throwing that away. And I am, I'm tall, but I'm a 6'6" guy who would kill to have your body because I could be the best of all time with how much work and commitment I'm willing to put in." But you've kind of mentioned this, just the advantage of height. And like you were even saying this is outlandish. And I want to admit that neither Arturo or myself, and even the numbers, even just the standard team level defense numbers won't even say this. Andrea Bargnani is a horrible defender. But he has one advantage, which has been shown in some research, is he's really tall. And you were kind of saying you could almost do kind of a cheat, like a Moneyball cheat, which is to say, you're a really tall guy. David Lee, you're really tall. So you're not a good defender, but if we put you next to a good defender, you just need to stand here. Andrew Bogut's going to handle the defense. And if you stand here, your height will basically be a defensive asset because you're a tall person basically hindering the offense.
Right. And again, this is actually like with Bargnani has worked sometimes, and some of the Knicks writers wrote about this, but this will work as long as the other team's not smart. A lot of teams aren't smart. But like, there's a famous matinee where the Knicks got destroyed by the Spurs, and because the Spurs basically are like, oh, you're going to put Bargnani in the middle of the floor, so we're going to basically just move the ball around and just get him to cross over. Like, we'll get him to move, cross over his feet over, and stumble, and that's what they did for the entire game. So I mean, like, but what I'm saying is, like, if you have an above-average post defender who's protecting the rim, as I said, if you have Kevin Garnett, you can put Glenn Davis next to him, and he'll look okay. Because all Glenn Davis really has to do is, like, Garnett's protecting the rim. All Glenn Davis has to do is protect, like, the passing lane and make sure you don't have a backdoor cut, right? So it's about kind of the level of responsibility. I need a primary defender kind of on the wing, on the ball, and I need somebody who's at the rim. And if I can get those two things, I can cover up a lot of holes. I can cover up a lot of David Lees and Glenn Davises of the world on defense. And it does seem like and again, this is what the video with Coach Chick was going. It's like we're looking at this and go like, how does it work that these teams who we know have guys who, when you look at the tape, are not great defenders, are still kind of great defenses. And it's, as I said, it's because if you ask them to be the primary defender, then it doesn't work. If you ask them to be the secondary defender, right? There's only one ball at the court. So if you ask them to be the secondary defender, then that's okay. I mean, it's diminished responsibilities. Like you can't lead the team, but you can be the guy who's kind of just helping. And
That's a
fascinating
fascinating term, diminishing responsibilities. I like that.
Yeah, because and again, it's like so. I'm looking at like Bargnani, for example. It's like, and again, you can even like in 2014, Bargnani was a slightly above average defender, but he was playing next to Tyson Chandler, right? So
That's
and again,
and this is one of my.
But here's the interesting thing, and I mentioned this as well before. Tyson Chandler has probably had like his worst defensive career, like year of his career last year, and it's partly because what happens is when you do that, then the guy who's the primary defender has to pick up the slack. So I think, and I don't have it in front of me, but Bogut numbers kind of go down when he's playing next to David Lee in the sense that like he's having to cover for the fact that David Lee is not a very capable defender. Right, but so and we've seen this with Tyson Chandler before, where like he's playing next to like Melo and Stat, or like Bargs and Melo and Stat, and like he's a great defender, but his own like defensive numbers go down because I'm not only covering my guy, I got to cover like Melo's guy when he screws up, or Stat's guys when he screws up, or Bargs guys when he screws up, right? So this is where the defensive stats gets kind of tricky, right? So the great defenders have to cover up.
I just think the reality, and this is just. Especially with what you're showing now, and this is just the unfortunate truth, many people, when we talk advanced stats in the NBA, wrongfully make the argument that there are too many interaction effects for us to know who's good. And this is just false. We know who the difference makers in the NBA are every year. And because of how the league is constructed, because there are 30 teams and really only 10 guys that can make a difference, that gives a lot of power. Defense, which, by the way, when you look at Dave Barry's work, and I'd say even your work, we would agree accounts for a very small portion relative to the other stats we have. There may just be a ton of interaction effects that we have to accept are not easy to pull apart when we're looking for good defenders, unless, I think this is a point you've made, if you're a great defender, you get past those interaction effects. But when we start arguing about average defenders versus mediocre versus a little bad, those guys are just kind of stuffed together.
I think this is an idea where, like, and again, if these two people agree, it's like, I agree with this idea. I think Dave agrees with this idea. Dave Barry agrees with the idea, and I think Dean Oliver agrees with the idea, which is like you need to have like you have your build term, but you need to have like that great defender. And actually, I stretch it further. Dave and Dean will say the great rim defender. I'll say the great rim, like one great rim and one great wing defender if I want to have an elite like defensive team. And again, once I have that,
Bogut and Iguodala.
Bogut and Iguodala, or like Tony Allen and Marc Gasol, right? Yeah. So or Kawhi Leonard and Tim Duncan. Although the Spurs have the luxury of having Splitter and Danny Green, right? So they have like the one and the two, which actually makes them like really, really good in terms of
as we were making a joke on the replacement level podcast, the Spurs are a cheat code because their replacement level is, hey, pick someone off the bench and we're still a playoff team.
Yeah, no, I mean they can still pull together an elite defense just with their second unit. If they send their starters home, they can still pull up an elite defense. But the point being that once you have that, then kind of you've kind of got it figured out. And again, we've seen this like laid out because we have these like subpar defenders who are like being covered up by just having these two guys as long as you play the right scheme and it gets coached right. So it's again, I mean, I'm looking at, for example, like, we know Iguodala is great and we know David Lee is atrocious on defense, right? But like even with David Lee, so David Lee was a -1 in 2012, -7.5 in 2013, but we look at him in 2014, he's actually an above average defender, right? And it's not that David Lee all of a sudden kind of became a better defender. I think it's mostly because of the fact that he's playing next to Bogut now, and he has a different set of. And
let me ask you a question. And I'm sorry to get us way off on a tangent because this is some of the first stuff we've talked. And again, I hold us to this, by the way, people out on the internet. This comes out vetted, or if it comes out, it comes out with a warning label, work in progress,
Yeah,
But what I want to ask you,
all defensive stats are a little wonky right now. We're working on them right now. So
but,
that's the vetting. We're working on making them better.
but what I was going
So
to ask you on your point, and I don't know how easy this is to determine. This may be one of those where you have to do box score, have someone who knows what they're looking at, kind of watch. You kind of made the point of being primary, secondary, and this is an annoying thing that we have to accept in basketball. So, for instance, we might have a season where a player plays poorly, and we say this player had a bad season. And someone comes in and says, well, the reason they played poorly is the coach played them as a shooting guard. They're really a small forward. This isn't their fault. It's the coach's fault. And we look and we go, you know what? You're probably right. The problem is we can only grade what happened. We can't grade what ifs, right? We can't grade.
we can't get potential. Yes.
Yeah. We can't say what if Carmelo Anthony had played center as a rookie with the Nuggets. We can't. We can shift the numbers, but even then we accept, well, even if we say wins produced, what would he have done as a center? Well, he didn't play center as a rookie. Okay.
Yeah.
So my question to you is like to defense is, can you make the distinction? Who was the primary? Who was the secondary? These kind of things on defense, and then say grade them on that, and then actually you have a thing where you can say, well, look, he's not a good defender because when he was the primary defender, he did bad. But by the way, when he played secondary, he was fine.
Well, I think no, not at the level where I'm at, which is like we've gone from season to game, and I think even at the play-by-play level, you can make some distinction. That would be the next level where you can make the distinction on who's actually on the ball on each particular play. I think eventually this is the value of like having the cameras out there, because what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to do the play-by-play where you look at who the guy who's actually close to the ball is, and like you'll be able to get data on who the primary defender is and the primary wing defender. So who's actually playing on the ball and who's actually kind of anchoring the defense, because really it is kind of like.
And then a question there with what you were saying is, and this has been one of my, I don't want to say criticisms of Synergy Sports, but just observations that's pretty clear. When you notice, and wow, we've gotten way off tangent. If you notice that, Kenneth Faried is guarding Kobe Bryant, that's my go-to, by the way. It's the only example I have. Apologies. Something went wrong, right? There was no play in the defense ever constructed where Kenneth Faried should have been the one guarding Kobe. He rotated, or there was a switch, or something happened for that to be the case. So, with kind of what you're saying, with future stats, we can know, was this person on the ball originally, or did they get swapped out? Or, are they defending because they were supposed to be, or were they defending because they ended up there?
Well, no, I think the point being is that there's all these interaction effects, but as always, what we're looking for is, can we identify like the large factors that affect this? And I think with data, we get closer and closer. And to me, I kind of look at it as, let me look at, so what is it telling me, like, for defense, that the best defensive seasons that I've seen are, right? So does it make sense to me? Is it practical? And it's saying David Robinson in 92, Hakeem Olajuwon in 91, Ben Wallace in 2002. That's pretty good. I mean, like, if I see that, and then Eric Bledsoe in 2013, which is kind of an interesting name to come up. And then Robinson in 95, 99, Olajuwon in 89. And then Jordan shows up at like a little further below in 88. So do these names make sense to what we see? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you have to kind of look at the fact that like when it's a really big effect, it's going to be much easier to spot. When we're looking at like the fine detail of interaction, then it's going to get really hard. But you said it, like the value added is in identifying the big effect. Like when you get into small interactions, the value is much, much, much less. And I think we'll be able to eventually get there, but I think what's going to get really tricky is how do we track what you're saying, like who the primary and who the secondary defender is, so we can kind of assign what the points are. Because right now we're making an assumption, and I've seen it. Kobe Bryant is a good example where like the Lakers would actually have Artest covering Kobe's man, and so you see an outsized defensive effect for Kobe, which isn't really just Kobe. It's because Kobe's not actually covering. They're giving him a break on defense, right? So
that might be the right move. And I mean, if we're talking about one of the terms that comes up in stats, and we can start winding down on this because we're almost at an hour, and that's what I want to keep us at, is actionable effects as a GM. And so one of the questions you should have is, if you're getting a player as a defensive specialist or someone who's going to help out your defense, do they really, and by the way, this is most moves for most GMs, most players aren't going to make a significant difference on your team. This is just how the NBA works. most of the trades that we see in the offseason, we just shrug our shoulders at because you're trading the 100th best player for the 110th best player in a second round pick, which will probably turn into the 200th best player. Weird. Had like a lisp there, but it doesn't really matter that much. And so I think that becomes important. And one of the things that defense long term is that I still think we overrate it. And one of the questions I would have to you is the inverse. And on another podcast is players that appear to just show up as really, really bad. And if it's as true, and to what degree we might be able to bring them, because, I'm sick of hearing, I don't care. I'm going to stress this. The Houston Rockets had, I think, a top 10 or top 12 defense in the league last season. So not below average. There is no way James Harden's defense was so bad that it did not overcome. And that's if you think his defense is bad, which, I probably, but I haven't verified. His offense is amazing.
Remember what I said about this, which is like they've got the rim protector and they've got the great wing defender. They've got the two. I mean, and Harden, and even when you look at Harden's numbers, and I've said this, they're interesting because like he does his great offense actually makes his opponents kind of drag themselves down. So his numbers, he shows up much better than you would expect defensively. I think partly because he's not playing the primary role on defense on that team, and he doesn't have to, and they don't ask him to. And I think also the fact that, like, as I said, there is a certain fatigue element kind of involved. And you were kind of mentioning is how consistent this is. And I looked at a guy who changed teams a couple of times. So Ben Wallace, right? So Ben Wallace, his impact from 2002 to 2009, right? Which is like, was at least, it was about 3 points, 2.5 to 3 points every season, whether he was playing with the Pistons or the Bulls or the Cavaliers, right? Now, the last 2 seasons, that numbers went down, but the last 2 seasons, he was kind of in the downswing of his career. But, and again, like you'll see these, for the guys who have outsized effects, these outsized effects do actually kind of stay the course across the careers, or they do seem to do that. And I think, again, but to the point you were making, I mean, is that something that happens with the worst guys? And I mean, I think when you're talking about the bad effects, I think a lot of the really terrible numbers that we're going to see, or my impression of it, is a lot of it is going to be, because I assume that the guys who make the NBA are generally good players, it's because you have these good players who place in bad roles. So you're asking a guy who should be taking maybe 10 shots a night to take 30 shots a night. Or you're asking a guy who should be the secondary defender or the third defender, like, to be your primary rim protector. And I think that's where you get into like all sorts of real like badness. And I think so there is something to be said about, and I was hearing this on a football podcast. So they're talking about like what you really want to do is you take your mediocre like second cornerback and turn him into your fifth cornerback, right? You're like above average fifth cornerback. It's the same thing. It's like, so if Tristan Thompson is my starter, then I have a problem. If Tristan Thompson is my third guy off my bench, then wow, he's way above average for that. And I think that kind of gets to the point. It's like you want to build depth, you want to build kind of the appropriate skills, and you want to put people in the appropriate positions. And I think that's where the stat stuff is going to start getting tricky, because we're going to have to start, as you're saying, it's like, how do we identify these individual roles and these little things that are making the difference, right?
Well, even Ari, I've loved Ari's note of this, and this still gets weird, where he says, look at what they're doing on the court, not what they're assigned, and kind of judge them on that. And that's a great start, but you still run into problems like you pointed out, and I don't know how true this is, with Adelman at not wanting any rim protection. Well, if Kevin Love is not assigned with protecting the rim, we're not going to see him foul as much as he might otherwise naturally, goes out of that system. I don't think these effects are big. That's the general rule we've had when we look at player consistency year to year. Even when they change teams, players tend to be who they are. But what we're not saying, and we would never say, and in fact, it's one of the reasons we argue week to week about coaches and stuff, is that there are ways you can improve or hamper your players. And this turns into a weird one, is what role you put the player in.
I think there's the misnomer on that, which is, and I think there's a difference between how Dave thinks about that and how I think about it. Dave thinks about the fact that the coaches doesn't make a difference. I think about it from the point of view that generally what happens is the coaches all have the same philosophies, all grew up in the same schools, and they all have like groupthink. So generally, when a player changes teams, you don't expect that player to change roles, because they'll just do whatever.
Unless it's the fun point to your point.
When
the Spurs.
When you're going to a team that's smarter than that, where the Spurs actually succeed, or where I think the Heat were actually doing this. I think other teams that are actually good at this, or the Rockets were like a team that's like thinking about the game in a different way, or the Bulls defensively. So a team that is thinking about this a different way will take a player and move him to a different role. And this is why, like, you'll see certain coaches that'll make a difference because they don't have that groupthink. And I think that's where kind of the game. It's kind of like, we're fixed into like this idea of the basketball. And I wrote a Sloan paper about it, which is like we're fixed into this idea of basketball, and the teams that are kind of breaking from that are kind of evolving the game. This is where you're going to see players kind of evolve, because this is why I say, like, I think the next frontier is to say, look at the player and go like, well, you should be doing this, and get them to actually do that. And I think that's kind of, I've had long conversations with like actual NBA owners and like DMs about this, where like, you look, how do we get players to actually not only like, how do we get them to actually play smart, right? So how do we get them to do like what James Harden does, which he only takes smart shots, right? How do we get like Chris Kaman to do it, right? And I think this is, we've had famously had an argument with one of the owners on like the comment section. We said like, I can convert Chris Kaman to the right way to play, and we said you're not going to be able to, because generally what happens is like you can't change guys unless you have kind of a different system or a different culture, which is what the Spurs do. And we've kind of gone on a way off tangent.
That was actually a great ending thought, is looking at the future landscape of analytics. The questions we're going to have to start asking NBA teams is, how can we change players to play smarter? That's perfect. And that leads us right into shout outs. And in fact, I'm going to let you start shout outs, because you have two people that you've been interacting with recently that basically epitomize that exact thought.
So I've been talking a lot to Daniel Rowe, and I've done I love him for having me on the Real GM podcast. It's fun. I apologize to people who heard that for the clicking. It was a really good podcast, but we clicked. But even I heard it, and I had to read it because we went to some interesting places. And he gave us some shout outs, so it's always nice. And then I've also been working with Coach Nick, who I mentioned, B-Ball Breakdown, who does these great like statistical breakdown. Sorry, he does these great strategic breakdowns of coaching and different things, and we've been talking about different things. The last one we did was on defense, and we talked a lot about that fuzzy. There's that fuzzy kind of idea about how defensive stats, and you kind of have to take those stats, particularly with look at the context, to actually kind of figure that out. So those are two guys who do great work and who've been really kind to us. So I give them a shout out. It's B-Ball Breakdown and Daniel Rowe on Twitter.
All right. So, by the way, my first shout out, I'm going to do an audible, and we'll see if Brian, if you do this. If not, it doesn't matter. It's already been on the podcast. Arturo, actually, the entire 76ers for Kobe is one of the most brilliant things ever. I'm gonna include that as the first image on the podcast, right? Because that I hadn't even seen that. I apologize. I'm in and out, and I've been busy. But I saw that, and that was genius.
So the original idea was it was Howard Parkinson who was saying that like the Sixers were paying their roster Kobe. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I immediately went to the trade machine and traded the entire Sixers rosters for Kobe Bryant. And the Sixers are going to be able to do some crazy, crazy, crazy stuff this season. If you need to get rid of a $10 million player off your cap, call Sam Hinkie and offer him some picks, because he right now, and I said that he could take Kobe, Stat, Bargnani, and there was somebody else he could take, Nash. He could take all those 4 contracts on his cap without any real trouble if he wanted to. So wow. They're basically going to be involved in probably every single trade rumor that's going to come down the pike this year.
Well, that's definitely true. My second shout out, I'm going to do these. Second shout out is actually to Seabax, who is on the That Thing You Like podcast. As I mentioned, him and Brian Sherlaw did the great pizza versus taco debate, which derailed their own podcast a week ago. And I had to bring over here because I thought it was great. Seabax also has, or Chris Baxter, also has his own webcomic now, seabax.net. It's hilarious. Been a huge fan of theirs forever, so that's great. And then my final shout out, it's actually going to be to myself, because I made a tweet that I thought was hilarious. I didn't think it got enough love, so I'm going to cheat and use our podcast to throw it out there. I said I had a 3-step plan. This was a tweet. I was going to grab a pro sports team in Oxford. I was going to rename them to the Commas. I was going to win forever. Joke there being, I know I'm failing every step of being a successful comedian because I'm explaining the joke. The Oxford Commas. Come on. That's hilarious. Arturo just rolled his eyes at me in the pre-show, but that's fine. I thought it was great.
I'm not putting you over. I'm going heel on this podcast, so I'm not putting you over for that lame joke.
Yeah,
So no,
we had some. We had a good. It didn't end up happening either, but we had some good wrestling discussion, which was another one of our take a shot in the drinking game for the Boxscore Geeks. We had some great wrestling discussion pre-show. Didn't make it into the show, but yeah, Arturo definitely playing heel.
Oh, and so people don't think of it like I haven't like think. So the problem is like I haven't been writing like recently because I've been like kind of working on this metric, which is it's 600 and what is it 670,000 lines of data that I've had to process, which has made Excel do some interesting things. But I finally through that, and I've got a Hall of Fame piece that's floating around that Dre and I are still arguing about. That once I get it kind of
I think
up.
personally we should just make our own Hall of Fame page, and then we can even just say our votes, and we can throw whatever numbers associated, and then we can keep one of the coolest parts. And apologies, because I have been a hindrance because I have been stressing keeping us more organized than Nate Silver, basically. But basically, one of the coolest things you did in that piece is you kind of started saying who you'd want to start electing year by year, and it would definitely be really cool to have a Hall of Fame page where we just say, here are the players that are eligible. Here's how we would vote them in if we had the option right now, rank them. And then here's who's going to be eligible soon. And here's how. So keep it self-updating.
I think the most surprising thing to me for doing that, and it's a little bit of a spoiler for the piece, but I was surprised at how good of a job the Hall of Fame has actually done at getting historical, like pre-1979 players in. I could really not find any players where I'd say, like, this guy has to be. Like, a couple guys, I think I already mentioned somewhere, Selmo Beatty. It was the only guy who I could really find that I was like, this guy deserved, like him, Don Nelson with the player and coaching. And there was somebody else. God, it's one of the guys from the Fort Wayne Pistons who just didn't win a title. I forget his name, but those are just the historical guys. But I was surprised at how good a job the Hall of Fame has done for the pre-1979 players. The post-1979 players, 1977 players, I am not that impressed by, though.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny when you talk that, and yeah, by the way to end us on a tangent. That's another thing. Every time we go off on a tangent, take a shot. When Arturo and I have a wrestling podcast about Kevin Love, everybody's just going to be drunk in 5 minutes. But if you look at the old NBA, there was a real change, right? It used to be players that were voting on MVP. And George Mike, and this is one of Dave Barry's famous quotes, when he was talking about the ABA, basically said the NBA is a big man's game, and these are the important skills. It really seems like around the 70s, there was this shift in mentality about the importance of just, layups and rebounds being what ruled the game. And while three-point shooting kind of started turning important, people just fell in love with, for instance, the mid-range jumper. So that was a really interesting change. But I actually agree. It's bizarre to read historical recollections of the NBA by people before all the advanced stats who had a much better understanding. Who's the coach I always bring up that I think it was the Royals, and then it was the Grizzlies when he came to the NBA?
No, you can just go Red Auerbach. Red Auerbach is great. I mean,
Auerbach for sure. I'm trying to think of the coach.
Oh God, the coach of the Knicks. I forget his name. The guy who's Phil's mentor.
I'll just put this in the thing. I don't want to hold this up because we are about to, we're winding down.
Yeah.
But, older coaches and older people seem to have a better understanding of NBA than modern, which is fascinating to me. That's a good thing to end on. And so that piece, the Hall of Fame stuff's coming up, and then we're going to rehash some of Patrick's thoughts on the Wolves. That's coming up tomorrow. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and we will see you. You're going to stop it? Okay, one last time.
Eventually we're going to get to season previews. That's coming too.
Yeah, my thought on previews. I think they're a good part of the site and a good thing to have, but I'm never, as my general thought is with how hard stuff is to predict, I'm never a fan, and
Oh no, I'm just talking about bringing out the rosters, man.
Yeah, we'll get it, but that is a good thing to preview. We'll see if the Nuggets make the cut. All right, that's our show for this week, and we will see you next week.